In this city, power hides in the shadows, and the truth fights to survive. From the tapes of Watergate to the chaos of the Capitol, every secret has a price. In Washington, D.C., truth is not a virtue, it's a currency. It's traded, hoarded, buried, and sometimes destroyed. And when it surfaces, it never does so quietly. For 50 years, American democracy has been defined not only by elections and ideals, but by scandal. Moments when the walls of power cracked open just enough for the world to glimpse what really goes on behind closed doors. This is the story of those cracks, from the age of Watergate to the chaos of the Capitol, and how each one changed the nation's faith in its own government. Washington gleams on the surface, marble domes, clean lines, flags in the wind, but beneath, it's a labyrinth of influence and secrecy. Here, ambition isn't the exception. It's the oxygen. Journalists call it the swamp. Politicians call it the system. But for those who've seen it up close, it's something far darker, a machine that runs on loyalty, fear, and silence. Every decade, a new scandal ignites, exposing what happens when that silence finally breaks. It began like something out of a bad spy novel. June 17, 1972. 5 men in business suits were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate office complex. They weren't after cash. They were after secrets. The burglars carried wiretapping devices, cameras, and stacks of blank film. They had been sent to gather political intelligence, sanctioned not by mob bosses or foreign agents, but by operatives tied directly to the White House. At first, officials called it a third-rate burglary. But this was no ordinary break-in. The evidence, cash-filled envelopes, phone records, hotel keys, began to trace back toward President Nixon's re-election committee. Meanwhile, 2 young reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, started to connect the dots. They worked the phones at night, knocked on doors, and met a secret informant in a parking garage lit by a single flickering bulb. He told them to follow the money. And when they did, the trail led directly to the Oval Office. While the White House dismissed the Watergate burglary as minor, 2 reporters refused to let it die. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post worked the phones at night, chased down leads, and knocked on doors across Washington. Sources slammed doors in their faces. Officials denied everything. But then came the whisper that changed history. In the middle of the night, Woodward would slip out of his apartment and walk to an underground parking garage. Waiting there was a shadowy figure, his face never fully revealed, his voice barely louder than a breath. He would later be known as Deep Throat. He never gave them the whole story. Only fragments, clues, a trail of breadcrumbs. His most famous words still echo across journalism: follow the money. Those words turned a third-rate burglary into the greatest political investigation of the century. The trail of cash, campaign donations funneled into black accounts, would eventually lead straight into the Oval Office. The investigation was relentless. Each week, new revelations struck like hammer blows. Cash traced back to the committee to re-elect the president. Secret funds moved through hidden accounts. And then, the tapes. Inside the Oval Office, President Nixon had recorded his own conversations. Dozens of hours of audio captured not just policy discussions, but plans to obstruct justice, silence investigators, and protect loyal aides at all costs. When the tapes were subpoenaed, Nixon fought tooth and nail to keep them hidden. He claimed executive privilege. He ordered aides to stall. But the courts pressed harder. The people demanded answers. When the tapes finally came to light, the nation heard a president not as a statesman, but as a conspirator, plotting in hushed tones, giving orders that would shatter the image of the presidency itself. On August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon became the first U.S. president to resign. His words that night, "I have never been a quitter," echoed hollowly as he boarded the helicopter and left the White House for good. The lesson of Watergate was clear: the presidency was not invincible. But it also planted a darker seed, that truth in Washington could only be pried loose when power collapsed under its own weight. The resignation of a president was unthinkable until it happened. The images burned themselves into history, Nixon waving stiffly as he boarded Marine One, the helicopter blades chopping the air, the White House shrinking behind him. For ordinary Americans, trust in government collapsed overnight. If the highest office in the land could be corrupted, what else was being hidden? Poll numbers reflected it, confidence in Washington dropped to historic lows. And in many ways, it never recovered. Across the country, newspapers carried the headlines in bold, black type, "Nixon resigns." Editorials spoke of shame, redemption, and survival of democracy. On wooden desks and smoke-filled newsrooms, typewriters clacked relentlessly, producing the first draft of history. Reporters who had once been dismissed as paranoid were suddenly hailed as heroes. But Washington itself did not stop. Power simply rearranged. Gerald Ford assumed the presidency, promising to heal the nation. Instead, his decision to pardon Nixon tore it further apart. Watergate had ended a presidency, but it also gave future leaders a lesson in survival. Scandal was dangerous, yes, but survivable. The presidency was not invincible, but neither was accountability. A decade after Watergate, Washington was once again hiding secrets. This time, it wasn't about political surveillance or campaign funds, it was about weapons, wars, and a global chessboard played in the shadows. In 1986, reporters uncovered a shocking truth: the U.S. government had secretly sold arms to Iran, officially an enemy state, and funneled the profits to support Nicaraguan rebels known as the Contras. Congress had explicitly banned funding the Contras, citing widespread human rights abuses. But in the Reagan administration, ideology was stronger than law. At the center of the scandal was Marine Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Inside the White House basement, he oversaw covert operations, rerouting money, shredding documents, and creating a trail of denials. When the story broke, America was stunned. Televised hearings followed, beaming images into living rooms nationwide. There was Oliver North in crisp dress blues, medals gleaming, testifying defiantly before Congress. He insisted he was defending freedom, that he was doing his duty. To his supporters, North was a patriot. To his critics, he was proof that Washington had become unaccountable. The truth was clear: democracy itself had been bypassed in the name of loyalty and secrecy. The Iran-Contra scandal left lasting scars. Several officials were convicted, but most were later pardoned. The message to America was unmistakable: when it comes to power, some crimes are too political to punish. The heart of the Iran-Contra hearings wasn't just in the evidence, but in the spectacle. There sat Oliver North, crisp uniform pressed, medals polished, posture rigid. To his supporters, he embodied honor. To his critics, he was the face of arrogance. Before a packed chamber, television cameras captured every gesture, every glance. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. Instead, he declared that he had carried out his mission faithfully, protecting America as he understood it. Senators pressed him about secret funds, shredded documents, and unauthorized operations. North calmly admitted he had destroyed evidence to protect lives, he claimed. The country was divided. Some saw a soldier following orders. Others saw a man who had put himself above the Constitution. The real scandal wasn't just what had been done, but how unapologetic the defense of it was. By the end, North was convicted on several counts, though they were later overturned. His testimony left one enduring image burned into America's memory: a government official openly admitting to breaking the law, and doing so with pride. The Iran-Contra scandal confirmed what Watergate had already revealed: when ideology and power collide, the rules of democracy are too easily rewritten. The Cold War had ended, the economy was booming, and a new president promised a new era of honesty and empathy. But in Washington, the one thing that never changed was temptation. What began as a financial investigation called Whitewater quietly expanded into something more personal and far more explosive. In 1998, whispers of a relationship between President Bill Clinton and a young White House intern, Monica Lewinsky, grew into a national obsession. For the first time in history, the private life of a president became the public's entertainment. Late-night hosts cracked jokes. News anchors dissected rumors. Every denial, every phrase, became part of a political circus. Clinton stood before the nation and declared, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." But when evidence surfaced proving otherwise, the denials collapsed. The Starr report, hundreds of pages long, became front-page news. Its content was scandalous, its implications constitutional. Congress impeached Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice. Yet when the Senate voted, he was acquitted. For many Americans, it wasn't about policy anymore, it was about morality. Could a man who lied under oath still lead a nation? The scandal blurred the line between politics and tabloid spectacle. Washington became a stage where truth and shame traded places. The trial of a president played out not in secret chambers, but under the brightest lights in America. The word impeachment, once whispered only in history books, was now shouted across every headline and TV broadcast. The evidence was no longer in question. The question was moral: could a leader who lied under oath continue to govern? In December 1998, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Bill Clinton on 2 counts, perjury and obstruction of justice. The Senate chamber became a courtroom, with Chief Justice William Rehnquist presiding, and the nation watching. In the end, Clinton survived. The Senate failed to reach the votes needed for removal. He remained in office, scarred but standing. The verdict was divisive. Supporters saw redemption, critics saw hypocrisy. Washington moved on, but something irreversible had changed. Scandal had become entertainment, politics had become theater, and the truth was whatever people wanted it to be. For the first time, Americans realized that surviving a scandal was less about innocence, and more about endurance. The Clinton era ended not in disgrace, but in fatigue, the nation tired of its own outrage. And yet, the echoes of that era would follow every administration that came after. September 11, 2001, the day the world changed. The skies were quiet, the towers had fallen, and the word security took on a new meaning. In the months that followed, fear became the nation's driving force, and Washington turned that fear into policy. The Bush administration began shaping a case for war against Iraq. The claim was simple but terrifying: Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and maybe even nuclear. Those words, weapons of mass destruction, echoed through every press briefing and dominated every headline. But behind closed doors, intelligence analysts were raising doubts. The evidence was weak, inconsistent, or based on unreliable sources. Still, the momentum was unstoppable. On March 20, 2003, U.S. forces invaded Iraq. Cameras captured the skies over Baghdad lit with missiles and fire. The operation was sold as liberation, a strike for freedom. But as months turned to years, no weapons were found. Inspectors combed the deserts and bunkers. Every report came back empty. The truth began to unravel: the intelligence had been exaggerated, the threat distorted. What had been sold as necessity was revealed as deception. The Iraq War cost hundreds of thousands of lives, trillions of dollars, and America's moral authority on the world stage. For the second time in 30 years, Washington had proven that secrecy and fear could move a nation faster than truth ever could. As the war in Iraq stretched from months into years, the truth became harder to contain. What was once sold as liberation began to look like occupation. Cities burned. Families fled. And the faces of soldiers returning home carried the weight of disillusionment. Intelligence officials began to speak out. They admitted the reports of weapons were exaggerated, even fabricated. The evidence used to justify invasion had been built on fragile assumptions, pushed forward by political momentum. In congressional hearings, senators questioned how such a catastrophic decision could have been made. Some blamed the intelligence community. Others blamed the White House. But deep down, the nation knew fear had done what logic could not. Across the world, America's image changed. Allies questioned its word. Enemies saw opportunity. The war had cost hundreds of thousands of lives and destabilized a region for generations. Inside the Pentagon, officials struggled to explain the absence of weapons of mass destruction. They shifted narratives, first claiming they'd been moved, then that the mission had always been about freedom. But for those who lost loved ones, no explanation could rewrite the truth. The war had begun with a lie, and ended with a question: how many more would be told in its name? The age of secrecy didn't end with war, it simply moved online. By the early 2010s, the new battlefield wasn't foreign soil. It was information. Edward Snowden, a contractor for the National Security Agency, sat in front of glowing screens in a nondescript government facility. He had access to the kind of data most people didn't know existed: emails, phone records, search histories, even webcam feeds. What he saw changed him. He discovered that the government wasn't just spying on foreign threats. It was spying on its own citizens, tracking calls, monitoring messages, collecting every trace of digital life in the name of national security. In June 2013, Snowden leaked thousands of classified documents to journalists at The Guardian and The Washington Post. The revelations were staggering. Programs like PRISM and Xkeyscore proved that mass surveillance wasn't a conspiracy, it was reality. The government called him a traitor. Others called him a hero. He fled first to Hong Kong, then to Moscow, where he remains in exile. His leaks changed everything, from how journalists protect sources to how tech companies handle privacy. But they also raised a darker question: can a democracy survive when every word, click, and call is monitored? In Washington, officials defended their actions. They said it was about safety. But for millions of Americans, the line between freedom and control had vanished. By 2016, Washington had weathered decades of scandals, but none like this. This one didn't involve burglars or secret files. It didn't start in a smoky backroom. It started on a screen. Hackers linked to Russian intelligence breached political servers, stealing emails and leaking them online. At the same time, thousands of fake accounts flooded social media, spreading false stories, manipulating outrage, and sowing division among voters. The goal wasn't to pick a side. It was to make Americans distrust each other. When the election ended, the country was split not just politically, but psychologically. Every story, every post, every headline was suspect. The truth itself had become negotiable. Intelligence agencies launched investigations, tracing digital footprints across continents. The Mueller report later confirmed what many had feared, that a foreign power had targeted the heart of democracy, exploiting freedom of speech as a weapon. But in Washington, denial came faster than reform. Politicians argued, the media divided, and social networks grew more powerful, their algorithms rewarding anger over accuracy. America had entered a new kind of war, one fought not with guns or bombs, but with memes and misinformation. The scandal wasn't just interference. It was revelation, that truth could be engineered, that democracy itself could be hacked. January 6, 2021, a date that will echo through American history. On that cold winter morning, lawmakers gathered inside the U.S. Capitol to certify the results of the presidential election. Outside, thousands of protesters assembled, waving flags, chanting slogans, demanding the results be overturned. Hours later, the unthinkable happened. Barricades fell. The crowd surged forward. Police lines broke under the weight of rage and disbelief. Windows shattered, doors splintered, and the halls that once symbolized democracy were flooded with chaos. Lawmakers scrambled for safety. Tear gas filled the air. Amid the smoke and confusion, the American flag waved beside symbols of defiance, a vision that felt impossible, yet was real. In the aftermath, 5 people were dead, dozens injured, and the Capitol scarred. The images shocked the world. Allies watched in disbelief as the cradle of democracy seemed to turn against itself. Investigations began immediately. Arrests followed. But the damage wasn't just physical, it was psychological. America had looked in the mirror and seen something it could no longer deny, the consequence of decades of division, distrust, and disinformation. Washington, D.C., the city where history is written and rewritten, where truth is both weapon and casualty. In the aftermath of half a century of scandals, from Watergate to Iran-Contra, from Iraq to the Capitol, the question remains, how much truth can a democracy handle? Every decade has its reckoning. The faces change, the technology evolves, but the rhythm stays the same: ambition, deception, exposure, denial. What began with burglars in a hotel ended with citizens storming their own government. The scandals of the past were about secrets. The scandals of today are about noise. Everyone speaks, no one listens, and somewhere in the chaos, accountability disappears. But even now, the pursuit of truth continues, in whistleblowers, journalists, investigators, and everyday people who refuse to look away. Because in Washington, truth never dies. It just waits for someone brave enough to uncover it again. The story of America's political scandals isn't just about corruption. It's about the resilience of a nation still trying to live up to its own promise. Power will always tempt. Secrets will always seduce. But the cost of truth, that remains the price of freedom.